Okay, so on to part two, and I want to start here with a very, very famous sculpture by Thomas Crawford, known as The Progress of Civilization, which is on the Senate Rotunda building in Washington, D.C., and represents a scene of American progress, which is one of the big watchwords of the 19th century. Progress being the idea of the progress of civilization towards kind of our ultimate manifest destiny provided to us by God, getting bigger and better and stronger and frankly wealthier and so forth. So in the scene, this is on a governmental building. That's something worth knowing. And yet Thomas Crawford was trained in the classical tradition that we talked about in our last module. But it's worth saying, like, this is the United States representing its idea of itself and what it aspires to. And along the way, Native American groups are represented, again, in ways that dovetail with that idea of where civilization is going. So every, I don't know, it's like 3 or 4 years, you'll see if you pay attention, one group or another asking to have this removed. Either more often than not a Native American group or someone who's very left-leaning, finding this to be a repugnant, moment of our history. But frankly, I think these things should be left in place so as to remind us of what our history is all about. This is how it looks if I pull it in a little bit closer, and I'll keep getting us closer along the way. And I just want to take you through the iconography. First of all, I should have just said this. Most of our governmental buildings look like ancient Greek or Roman temples because primarily Thomas Jefferson believed that these buildings, the architecture of Greece and Rome, was an embodiment of their democratic and republican values, and thus he adopted these things. We're hearing a little clamoring of that around today as well. In this area known as the pediment, you don't need to remember this, but that triangular area of the classical architecture, we have all of these scenes represented in sculpture. In the center, right in the center of this, is a scene that personifies America, right? Personifications are almost always women. She has stars in her hair to associate her with the Americas. Underneath her left hand is the bald eagle, now our national bird of America. In her right hand are laurel wreaths, which are symbols of eternity. Laurel wreath is what you might remember Caesars wore in their hair to show that they were, or on their head to show that they were leaders. Off to her right-hand side is a rising sun, which is a symbol of God and a symbol of promise, a symbol of tomorrow, a symbol of progress. Further to her right, our left, and always on the right-hand side in classical sculptures, the more important things, the things that are being extolled or are higher in value, are going to be pointed to. They're always on the right. It goes all the way back to Greek times. It's not always the case that things on the left are bad, but they're deemed less important. On the right-hand side, you see a militiaman, right? He's a citizen soldier. He looks a little bit like that rendition of George Washington by Jean-Antoine Houdon. He wears a merchant's outfit, but he has epaulettes on his shoulder. Remember why that's important. These are citizens willing to fight for America rather than a standing army that would be associated with empirical regimes in things like France and England and so forth, that people were fighting against. On the left-hand side, again, not as important, but certainly important in that it's close to the center figure, is a pioneer, and we'll come back to that side in a moment. So going off to our left, her right, you see the progress of civilization. The way that it unfolds, I don't think I've got close-ups of everything here. So the way that it unfolds is, follow my cursor down below, you've got a militiaman, and then next to him, you've got a merchant. And the merchant is teaching young children how to be a good merchant. His hand is on bales of whatever his produce is. Some people think that that produce is cotton, which would make sense by this point because the cotton gin has been invented. But you should be aware that our original cash crop, the one that we made boatloads of money on initially by selling it to Europeans, was tobacco. So it could be tobacco in there. Then if you go further off to this, our left-hand side, you see a teacher who is teaching a kid about, what teachers teach about. But next to him, you see an engineer with a cogwheel under one hand. So it tells you a little bit about what you're probably being taught here, which are practical educational tools, things that can be applied. If we go off to the other side, so we move over to her left, our right, you can see the pioneer very closely. And what is he doing? He's cutting down a tree, which is a symbol of him making use of those natural resources that God has given us so as to build his home, so as to build bridges, right, to make his life. And now's where it gets very odd. Off to go even further beyond that. So if progress of civilization is moving towards these things and now it's moving out west, it's going to come into contact with Native American groups. And those Native American groups include, as you see here, a young Native American boy who is carrying over his shoulder his game, what he has killed for his food. You see things that are supposed to look like wilderness and a snake down here, all of the pitfalls and dangers that you have to face. It is a Garden of Eden type scene, right? And just like the Garden of Eden that's full of plenty, that's kind of a paradise on earth, it's also fraught with all kinds of problems. And then right next to that, and I've taken it out of the sculpture so you can see it up close, is this scene of a Native American older man. And in this case, his hand is on his head. He's obviously looking down. He is a representation of the third stereotypical types of representations of Native Americans during this time. He is a doomed Indian. His way of life is over. He sees the progress of civilization coming his way. He accepts his fate as a doomed race. Resignedly, without fight, he gets it. The final scene that I can't show you up close because it's frankly kind of too painful to imagine that someone did this, but I'm going to get you fairly close, is this. Next to the chief is a Native American woman who holds in her hand a dead Native American child next to an open grave. That is a symbol that their future child is doomed, is dead. I know it's not very empathetic at all, and there are various arguments out there that are meant to say, or say that this is an acknowledgement of what we're doing to these people, a kind of form of white guilt. But nonetheless, this is the way that this artist chose to represent a doomed future. Again, over and over again, sculptors who were finding a little bit of work at this stage, representing scenes that would be associated with our national identity, and then, again, these sculptures will be placed on governmental buildings, will pick scenes that line up with that idea of our history. This is a work by Enrico Kosicki called Landing of the Pilgrims. Not surprisingly, you see the pilgrims coming ashore. They're already being greeted as if they are, special. The Native American gives corn to him, that big New World product, bends down on a knee to him as if already accepting the idea that civilization has come and that his way of life is passing. Or this scene also by Enrico Kosicki called Conflict of Daniel Boone and the Indians. Again, Daniel Boone, one of these heroes of American frontier life, kind of the original pioneer in some sense, in conflict with Native Americans. Look at how powerful the Native American looks. Look at how huge and mean his head looks. how the artist has tried to twist to show you the muscles of his back. And then, again, this conflict with Daniel Boone. Down below, a Native American has already been killed so that we know who is going to eventually win in this battle. Another famous sculpture by Horatio Greenough. Remember, Horatio is the one who did that, George Washington as Olympian god scene in the last lecture. This one's called The Rescue from 1837. It was up for about 15 years in Washington, D.C. before it proved too controversial, especially during the Indian Wars, and they took it down. But what we're witnessing here is something that's really, really common in the representation of the demonic Indian, isn't it? We see the demonic Indian looking over his shoulder at a personification basically of American justice. That hat on his head is a symbol of basically justice, who is stopping the Native American without actually causing him harm. He's just stopping him in his tracks. Before that Native American hacks up and look over on the left-hand side, the defenseless woman and child. Now, look at the look on the Native American's face. It's less demonic than it is kind of surprised, like, what was I doing wrong? Like a child caught doing something that he didn't quite know was not to do. And that gesture, that expression on the face is mirrored by another figure in this composition, the dog. So what does that say by saying, huh? Kind of that look? Just like a dog, Native Americans can be trained. They need to know better. It's a kind of conflation together of the Native American as savage with the idea that there's still some nobility there. We just have to teach them the right way. Notice, just for stylistic purposes, let me point out that, again, it's a classically trained artist. So he represents, this is a huge pyramidal form. He makes sure that we understand that this isn't even really a real white man. It's a personification of the idea of justice by making him enormous and towering over the other figure. Now, I just want to end today's lecture briefly by pointing you in the direction of something that I think is really quite interesting. When Native American groups were being put on reservations, one of the ways that they continued to create art and create some kind of their own history of events was through things known as ledger drawings, because they were oftentimes drawn, as you see here, on previously used pieces of paper, oftentimes lined paper. Now, they used the same visual strategies or visual styles that they would use in traditional painting on animal hides in particular. And you see some of that here. And what I mean by that is that I guess the best way to talk about, in very brief terms, because unfortunately this is not a class that can deal with Native American art as well as white American art, so to speak. So very briefly, the simple way to kind of draw attention to how the stylistics of these Native American drawings and their traditions differ from what we've been looking at is it's not the case that Native Americans are really not capable of representing naturalistic form. They're not interested in it. Kind of like on the first day when I said some of those limner artists aren't, again, skilled enough to represent natural form, but it's mainly because they never taught themselves to be skilled enough. They're trying to do something else. And what Native American artists seem to have been trying to do is communicate. So they're not trying to convince you that what you're looking at is reality or like reality. What they're trying to say is, I want to tell you a story, and I want to tell you this story through illustrative means that give you a lot of information. So stylistically, what you oftentimes see are things that look surprisingly two-dimensional versus what we've been looking at with art by trained artists. But what does this do, especially if you put a lot of that two-dimensionality in profile? It gives you information. We know in this ledger drawing here, which is created by a white bull, himself capturing a horse from the whites, we know that we see a horse here, we see a man on that horse, we know that that man on that horse is very powerful because he holds in his hand a very richly decorated war lance, right? We get all that information. We know that the horse is moving in the way that he's posed that horse, and we know what he's doing. He's going after another horse. He doesn't show us the face of the figure because that's not important. He shows you what he's wearing, he shows you what he's riding, he shows you what he's doing. So using two-dimensionality, using profiles, using broad areas of color, are ways to show you the most information in the most economic way possible. Notice all these things that look like they're flying through the air. These are bullets. So the whites are shooting bullets at him, but he's not going to be stopped. He's going to steal this horse from the whites themselves, exacting a kind of form of revenge on the whites, so to speak. In most of these drawings, by the way, the action moves from right to left. And if you've got some kind of hierarchy of important figures, usually that figure's on the right, although not exclusively. And again, this is the same thing if you're looking at drawings on animal hides of these people as well. Horses, by the way, are really important, right, to Native American, particularly Plains Native American groups. They're not native to North America. They were brought by the Spanish, but they were adopted very quickly by Native American groups. And they're symbols of pride, of heritage, of wealth, and as you see here, heroism. The ability to go capture or steal someone else's horse is something that takes a lot of bravery, takes a lot of cunning, takes a lot of practice and so forth. So that's part of Native American identity at this time. This is another drawing, ledger drawing in this case by Yellow Nose. Is that right? Yeah, of Little Bighorn. Just want to show you these very quickly. You can see the writing that was already on these images, or I'm sorry, on the paper itself. And then fights that are occurring in this case at Little Bighorn. Remember what this is all about. George Custer, of course, miscalculating his ability to defeat a group of primarily Sioux or Lakota people with a very small force and being annihilated in the process. And here's some of the ways that Native Americans represented these in these ledger drawings. This is Red Horse's Indian fighting Custer's troop at Little Bighorn. I'm just kind of letting you look at it for a minute. Very illustrative. So we see the Native American going in here. He's, killing off the U.S. soldiers. You got an American flag there, and he's doing something that is called a count coup, or touch the enemy with the flag. It's a symbol of bravery. And of course, he's exacting a kind of revenge and representing the story of the defeat of of U.S. forces at the hands of Native Americans in this famous battle. In other words, he's showing you and representing an important moment in Native American history, which probably U.S. artists are not going to want to show you, are they? Or again, big scenes of, in this case, Indians fighting Custer's troop, again, which again mimic the same types of representations that you would find on traditional materials, such as hides. Here is, let's see, this is cavalry troops, again by Red Horse, all in lockstep. And then he shows you dead horses here, and they're cavalry horses. So if you think a little bit, I think your text reading does a good job at this, how he's shown you how many have died and how kind of painful this is. Horses are very precious commodities, and also kind of spiritual animals for Native Americans. It's not just about defeating the enemy, it's about the cost of defeating the enemy. Again, I just wanted to show you a few of these to round out the story, to say something like there's this minor history through visual representations that continue once these people are placed on reservations, of parts of their history that are important. In this case, Indians that were killed by U.S. troops. Again, by Red Horse. This one's one bill of Lakota called Custer's War. Very detailed drawing, but the same thing. And then I also wanted to kind of show you, I don't want to say these are funny, because they're not. I mean, the history that they document isn't funny at all, but it's a curious way to learn about that history. One of the things that happened in some of the Indian wars is that a number of important leaders of various tribes were captured, and they were moved to Fort Marion near St. Augustine, Florida. And, you know, drawings were made of these kind of ledger drawings of this event to preserve this history. These are anonymous, of a train to Fort Marion. This is a scene known as Fort Prisoners Dancing for the Tourists, again by an anonymous Native American at Fort Marion. This would have been something that occurred all the time, where the people who had been captured were asked to dress up in their regalia and entertain white audiences with their dances. That, you know, it's turning spiritual traditions into entertainment for the white masses that had captured them. Probably for Native Americans, it was a way, at least at some level, to continue to have some connection to their past, but it pales compared to what it was before. Now notice how the artist represents this. He's not trying to show you an accurate representation. He's trying to show you, here's the dancing in the center, there's a fire involved, and the people are surrounding this on all sides. What he seems to focus on more than anything else, as your text points out, are the costumes that they're wearing. That the movement of the dancers is important here in their poses, and that the static nature of the tourists who are visiting to see this is emphasized here. He doesn't show you the faces of any of these characters at all, but he does pay a lot of attention to what they're wearing, particularly the women, because this stands out as important to whoever this artist is. Here are some of those people that are captured in an actual photo of the Fort Marion prisoners. This I just find precious. This is a scene of basically people being taught in the classroom at Fort Marion. You see the probably white woman kind of giving her lesson plan, standing up there, all the others sitting around the table. Now the Native Americans are all dressed in Western garb with their hair cut close. They could be anyone, right? But a ghost ancestor stands off to the side as a kind of stick drawing, witnessing the whole scene, as if to juxtapose their present condition with their past, traditions. Finally, I'm not going to say much about this at all, but I want you to be aware of it. One of the forms of resistance that occurs at near the end of the century are what are known as the ghost dance. Ghost dance ceremonies cropped up among and were practiced in different ways by different Native Americans as a form of opposition against their treatment. They were outlawed. They were a kind of commingling of various Native American tribal traditions with Christian narratives about kind of the end of days and a moment in time where white culture would be wiped out and Native American culture would return and prosper. It was a way of kind of drawing people together around a hopeful image of the future rather than the present conditions. And it was very, you would just have these few documentations in photographs of these ceremonies that were meant to continue to bond people together around the idea of the promise of a better tomorrow, right? So I just wanted to show you a couple of these. And it allowed Native American groups to practice primarily on their reservations some things that were part of their tribal traditions, including this ceremonial garb that would have been worn in the ghost dance ceremonies. There's a little bit more commentary on these in your textbook if you're interested about these. There's part of that ghost dance ceremony, a wooden sweat lodge and sacrificial pole that's part of the rituals. And then finally, what is this in response to? Well, it's in response to big kind of final battles in the Indian Wars between Native American groups and U.S. soldiers. This is a scene from basically the burial of the dead after the Battle of Wounded Knee. Battle of Wounded Knee in South Dakota was kind of one of the last of the major massacres of Native Americans who were holding out against U.S. forces. It was so cold at the time that the bodies were just piled up for a couple of days, and then later when it thawed enough that you could dig a big mass grave, that was done. What's so, tough to take about this image is really in this photograph by George Traeger called The End of the Ghost Dance. What you're witnessing is basically proud soldiers hovering over these dead, lesser, inferior creatures. It almost looks like, as your text points out, one of those kind of trophy hunts in a way, where people seem unaware of the humanity of the people that they've just killed. There doesn't seem to be any sense of anything other than pride in this, no lament at all. So that idea of the doomed Indian, just one last image, because they become more and more prominent, as you can imagine, near the end of the century, where these people's way of life is really not much in evidence anymore. I'm not saying that it's completely gone, but placed on reservations, distanced from their ancestral lands, various practices and rituals forbidden by law, starved basically of their heritage, and of course people recognize this. So I end today's lecture with Tompkins Madison's Last of the Race, which is a little bit self-explanatory, isn't it? They're looking off to the horizon, or at least the chief is, a symbol of the future, and they see nothing. The other two look back at their past, and all they can witness is destruction. The dog looks at the chief as if to say, what do we do now? And there's really no answers. Well, thank you for listening this week. I look forward to your participation in the discussion forum, and next week we'll go into American landscape painting.